Barelas is an inner-city neighborhood of Albuquerque, located immediately south of downtown. Originally a separate village that was absorbed into Albuquerque during the railroad-fueled growth of the 1880s, but it still retains a distinct identity. The boundaries of Barelas are Cole Avenue to the north, the railroad tracks to the east, the Rio Grande River to the west, and Cesar Chavez to the south. But Barelas does include the industrial park that goes to Woodward on the south. Major social, economic, and cultural trends have affected Barelas over the years. It shares advantages with other communities of being along the main route between Chihuahua, Mexico, and Santa Fe, the main trading center of a remote Spanish colony and later a Mexican territory. The railroad replaced the Camino Real, but Barelas still was in the path of this new means of travel, communication, and trade. The current population of Barelas is about 3,700 people, with about 2/3 of those being Hispanic. About 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was the first known European to use what became known as El Camino Real when he searched for the 7 cities of gold. In 1598, Juan de Oñate made reference to the Esteros de Mexica, which is the swampy land in the vicinity of present-day Barelas, as he explored the territory for La Nueva Hispania. In 1662, Coronel Gobernador Diego de Penalosa first visited the area around Barelas and recognizes that the location is an important crossroads and economic center between Mexico City and La Villa de Santa Fe. This area is in what became known as Barelas on the Camino Real. This formally established Barelas, the Barelas settlement predating even Old Town as the oldest neighborhood in the city. As evidenced by this map drawn by Don Bernardo de Miera y Pacheco, who was an early cartographer from the 1700s, it shows Barelas is on the map. El Camino Real was a well-traveled artery for over 2.5 centuries. Every 2 or 3 years, a caravan was sent north to Santa Fe, loaded with supplies. The wagons carried food items such as chocolate, olive oil, and sugar. Essential items such as gunpowder, paper, medicine, cloth, shoes, musical instruments, and sacramental wine were also sent. The caravans usually began in Chihuahua and headed north, traveling at about 10 miles per day. Pedro Varela Jaramillo and his brother Alonso Varela Jaramillo came to New Mexico as conquistadores. Varela was born in Compostela, Spain. About 1700, he established an estancia from which the community derives its name. It probably is the first Hispano settlement established in the area. The natural ford across the Rio Grande near the Bridge Street Bridge was named after the estancia owned by Varela. This crossing was used by the caravans traveling north along El Camino Real. This ford became a primary route for commerce and trade because it was the lowest point in the Rio Grande, less than 3 feet deep, and heavy mule and oxen-drawn carretas could ford it easily. In the colonial period, the surname Varela was spelled with a V, and it was later changed to a B, thus Barelas. On August the 10th, 1707, a petition for lands in the Barelas area was made by Antonio Barela to Capitan Martín Hurtado, alcalde mayor de Albuquerque. Capitan Hurtado recognized the importance of the area, and a ford was built across the river so that it could be used by the caravans crossing the Camino Real. It became known as the Barelas Crossing. Early records show that Barelas was called the San Nicolas Grant. The area was swampy for centuries and not very good for farming until acequias were built. Eventually, the settlement of Barelas turned to farming after several prominent Hispanic families colonized the area. Early development took place in and around the farms, which were adjacent to the swamps near the Rio Grande. This comprised much of what is now the South Barelas industrial area, where the National Hispanic Cultural Center, Bueno Foods, which by the way just is currently celebrating its 63rd anniversary in Barelas, and Rosa's Paper Goods, and El Modelo Foods, all located in the Barelas Industrial Park. After the ditches and acequias were built, and according to records, 30 to 40 houses were built along Barelas Road, just north of present-day Cesar Chavez Boulevard. In 1856, the U.S. government and the U.S. Army constructed the first ferry across the Rio Grande in the area of the present-day Barelas Bridge. The ferry was used to transport people, wagons, and livestock across the river. By 1860, there were more than 300 people living in Barelas, according to the census conducted at that time. In 1876, the first bridge was built across the Rio Grande in Barelas. That bridge was destroyed in the flood of 1884. As early as 1850, when New Mexico became a territory of the United States, plans were being made to bring the railroad to the area. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad built tracks through the mid-Rio Grande Valley and bisected the agricultural fields in Barelas. The construction disrupted the agricultural economy, but the construction of the railroad, the roundhouse, and the repair shops stimulated the urban development of Barelas. How the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad was built in Albuquerque is an interesting story. In February of 1878, railroad officials met with my ancestor, Jose Leandro Perea, who was the patriarch of a leading family and a major landowner in Bernalillo. The meeting lasted less than 45 minutes. The railroad men offered Perea $2 to $3 an acre for his land. Perea countered with $425 an acre, and he stood firm. Unaccustomed to receiving ultimatums, the railroad men rolled up their maps and papers and left town, heading to Albuquerque. Ironically, the quiet farming community of Barelas, just downstream from Bernalillo, was changed and would never be the same. There were many debates as to Perea's motive. Was it greed? His wealth already exceeded $2 million. Did he want more? Perhaps the invasion of the Americanos into Nuevo Mexico and the disruption of the Hispano way of life was his issue. Or could he just not bear to see his quiet agricultural community turn into a noisy industrial center with loud trains and machinery? But whatever his motivation, Barelas changed forever. From 1880 to 1923, the transformation of Barelas from a quiet farming village to the largest industrial complex in the territory happened fast and completely changed the area from mostly agricultural to industrial. The fertile fields were changed to subdivisions for housing, and eventually Barelas grew into a community of 1,200 people by 1900. There was a terrific migration of people that came to work for the railroad. Immigrants came from Mexico and other countries such as Italy and Germany, and many Nuevo Mexicanos came from all over New Mexico. My own family is a good example of this. My father, as well as several uncles and other family members, came from the mountain villages of Torreon, Mountain Air, and Manzano to obtain jobs with the railroad. The wages paid by the railroad were considered good for those times. The community of Barelas grew around the rail yards. Prosperity in Barelas took on many forms. New houses were built, and the chapel of San Jose Patriarca was completed in 1900, later to be replaced by Sacred Heart Catholic Church, which was built in 1921 at the intersection of 4th Street and Stover Southwest. And then it was demolished in 1965 because of structural difficulties. Church services were moved across the street into the Sacred Heart School Gymnasium, where I and Senator Manny Aragon, who's here with us today, played basketball while attending school there. The gym became the permanent home of Sacred Heart Church, and Mass and other services are still held there. New businesses sprung up. Barelas became a vibrant neighborhood. Many of the residents became entrepreneurs and opened businesses. Bareleños had everything they needed in their neighborhood. By 1940, employment at the railroad shops reached an all-time high of 1,500 workers. The impact to Barelas and Albuquerque as a whole was tremendous, with the economic impact roughly equivalent to present-day Intel. South 4th Street, at first a residential street, was declared U.S. Pan American Highway 85. It later became Route 66 and was a strong commercial district for the community. Several businesses located along 4th Street and still remain there, like Rupe Drugs, the Red Bull Cafe, Bromo Store, which is now the Barelas Coffee House, Ives Flower Shops, and El Modelo, which is still located on 2nd Street. Barelas was serviced by an electric trolley system in the early days. It ran along 3rd Street, connected Barelas to Old Town and the Sawmill area and the university. In 1934, the neighborhood's first community center was established at 1221 3rd Street. In the early 1940s, seed money was raised by the citizens of Barelas, the LULAC, and by the youth trainees from the National Youth Administration to fund a new community center. The new center was located at the intersection of Barelas Road and Hazelden Avenue and still services the community at that same location. A unique combination of pre-railroad adobes, railroad worker housing, and industrial buildings, large homes for wealthier residents, and buildings responded to the routing of the Pan American Highway were created. Older homes were remodeled or demolished or divided into apartments. Stores were built on the front of homes to attract customers. Additions were built, porches were added, new windows were installed, and old wings removed. Some historic buildings still remain in Barelas, including several homes on or near Barelas Road, also the railroad superintendent's home on 2nd and Pacific Avenue, and the railroad firehouse. The Red Ball Cafe and Bromo store, which is now the Barelas Coffee House, still stand. Bromo Gonzalez was the father of Michael Gonzalez, the owner of the Barelas Coffee House. Coronado School is an historic elementary school in Barelas, built in 1936 to 1937 as a public works administration project. It is the city's third oldest operating elementary school. Coronado School was added to the New Mexico State Register of Cultural Properties and the National Register of Historic Places. It closed in 1975 when Dolores Gonzalez Elementary was built to accommodate neighborhood children. It reopened on August 24th, 2009 as a magnet school. A number of buildings in and adjacent to Barelas were lost, such as the old Atlantic and Pacific Railroad offices, the Sandia Theater, the old Sacred Heart Church, and the Chute Boarding House and the Alvarado Hotel. Transportation has been an important part of the history of Barelas. In the early years, horses, mules, and oxen passed through the community. Later, trains and streetcars took their place, but the greatest impact came from the automobile. In 1926, Route 1, which went through present-day 4th Street, became U.S. Highway 85. Suddenly, the neighborhood was part of an interstate highway system which ran north and south. It also merged with Route 66, which ran east and west across the U.S. These two highways merged and crossed at the Barelas Bridge. The highways through Barelas produced some changes in the economy. By 1928, more than 3,500 cars crossed the Barelas Bridge daily. This traffic created new business for the area, such as tourist court, 5 service stations, and more than a dozen new stores. This access of the bridge and the lure of highway improvements attracted local residents. Most of the merchants during this period were Hispanic and bilingual. People from rural communities were attracted to this area for daily shopping needs. More farmers were now seen in the area stores because they wanted to shop where the employees spoke Spanish and where they could barter their goods and harvest for what they needed, and where several of the businesses offered credit. Villagers from the Sandia and Manzano Mountain communities were doing increased business. Rural customers brought loads of firewood and would sell it at the G&G fuel yards owned by Leo Baca, father of my old schoolmate Leon Baca. After unloading the wood, they would cross the street to trade at El Cambio groceries. I remember my mother telling me about the 2-day trips my grandfather made from Torreon in a horse-drawn wagon to sell vegetables and wood and other farm products in Barelas. World War II brought many changes. Employment at the Santa Fe Railroad shops reached an all-time high of 1,500 workers because every engine available was put into service. At the same time, many young Bareleños disappeared. Many joined the war effort, or many families migrated to the West Coast for munitions work in the factories. The cohesiveness of the community eroded. The war separated families who had lived for generations in Barelas. Some of the families left the area, some never returned. Because of the war, gas was rationed. This turn of events forced residents to ride bicycles and local women created the city's first women's bicycle corps. Food shortages meant that the families were planting gardens. These were called victory gardens. Residents bought bonds by having money deducted from their paychecks. The effects after the war were significant. Sheltered Nuevo Mexicanos who had lived here all their lives experienced a different lifestyle. The GI Bill made it possible to go to college. The Federal Housing Administration provided low-interest, long-term loans to veterans, and many of these vets did not want to return to the old neighborhood. A mass exodus occurred to the Heights and other neighborhoods. The impact on women was difficult. When the men returned, many had gained independence and financial security. They liked their jobs and having their own paychecks. The difficulty was in returning to their roles as housewives and mothers. Following the war, traffic was bumper to bumper on South 4th Street. In 1948, statistics showed that 5,000 vehicles crossed the bridge daily. By 1952, that number went to 20,000 vehicles per day. Because of this, economic development shifted to tourism and shopping. Many stores opened on 4th Street. Businesses catered to tourists traveling the interstate. These were the glory days of Route 66. Albuquerque was a small town, and downtown was a few minutes away, where you would find department stores, drugstores, doctor's offices, lawyers' offices, and government offices. Traveling Route 66 was an adventure, and after World War II, Albuquerque was booming. There was plenty of work, and there was money. The 1950s were a commercial success for Barelas. 4th Street was booming. 40 new stores were opened and operating. 4 new supermarkets opened in Barelas, including the first Piggly Wiggly supermarket. Maybe some of you remember Piggly Wiggly's. The car dealership opened, the Durand car dealership opened up. 4 new service stations, the Figaro Barbershop, Tingley baseball field where the old Albuquerque Dukes played. The Albuquerque Zoo expanded, and by the way, the Albuquerque Zoo just celebrated its 100th anniversary in Barelas. Bertinelli's San Antonio drugstore opened, Bromo's food market, Fito's restaurant, which is now the Barelas Coffee House, the Coronado Cafe, owned by John Gutierrez, father of my childhood friends, John and Ralph Gutierrez. Mike's Food Market opened. The owner was Mike Ellered, who represented the district at the New Mexico legislature for many years. The Buckhorn Barn, the Buckhorn Bar owned by Benny and his dad, opened in Barelas. The Blue Moon nightclub, the Crossroads Bar owned by the Garcia family, the EMP Bar owned by Art Dow. Dr. Vergara's medical office operated on 4th Street for more than 50 years. Dr. Vergara was my childhood doctor when I was a kid. Salazar and Sons, Crawlett, and Garcia mortuaries were in Barelas and all owned by Barelas residents, Barelas families. El Modelo restaurant opened. It's still operating on 2nd Street, and I think it's getting ready to celebrate its 100th anniversary. Birupa Drugs opened. We even had our own semi-professional baseball team called the Albuquerque Grays. They competed with teams from all over the area. Barelas also had its own favorite bands, the Barelas Syncopators, Tommy G and his band. Tommy was the brother of Mike Gonzalez, who is the owner of the Barelas Coffee House. Interestingly enough, you might want to know that Tommy G and the Charms played when Dorella and I got married. They played for our wedding dance exactly 50 years ago. We just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary, May the 7th. And our old friends Dickie and Marcy Tafoya conducted the Ernie Ricardo Band. These businesses attracted large numbers of customers from San Jose, Armijo, Atrisco, Los Padillas, and Old Town. The establishment of large stores owned by large corporations signaled the end of the smaller family-owned stores in Barelas and in other neighborhoods. Some small businesses survived because they provided a friendly, down-home atmosphere and service. The first signs of economic decline were felt after World War II. The Santa Fe Railroad decided to convert from steam to diesel engines. The locomotive repair shops were consolidated in Cleburne, Texas, and San Bernardino, California. That reduced the workforce from over 1,000 workers to less than 100. A new freeway system through Albuquerque completely bypassed 4th Street and the Barelas Bridge and the Barelas neighborhood. Construction and new businesses came to an abrupt halt. After the completion of I-25 and I-40, 4th Street continued to attract customers for a few years, but urban renewal put an end to that clientele when federal programs relocated about 1/3 of the population to other communities. Urban renewal eradicated parts of the neighborhood. The area south of Bridge Boulevard, which was known as Lower Barelas or Tortilla Flats, was knocked down and was replaced by the Barelas Industrial Park, where currently you will find Rosa's Paper Goods, Bueno Foods, the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and the El Modelo restaurant. The final blow came with the construction of Civic Plaza in 1974. That cut off the traffic from north to south on 4th Street and diverted it to I-40 and I-25 and to Winrock and Coronado shopping centers. People left the neighborhood. Some abandoned their homes and businesses. A more dramatic sign of economic decline became obvious in the neighborhoods when drug addiction, burglary, and vandalism rose. This infected this once thriving district. This trend began with simple things like removal of business signs and canopies. Windows were boarded over, bars and steel grates were added, and many stores closed permanently. We suffered the economic and social consequences of drugs, crime, gang activity, and absentee landlords, which continue to be the scourge of older neighborhoods. Thus, it eroded the spirit of the people who remained. No one would admit that they actually lived in Barelas because the neighborhood was so downtrodden. By the mid-1970s, several projects were started which led to the eventual revitalization of Barelas. Dolores Gonzalez Elementary School was built adjacent to the zoo. The Barelas Multi-Service Senior Center was located on 7th Street, adjacent to the Barelas Community Center. The Rio Grande Swimming Pool was expanded near the zoo. KOB and KGGM TV stations were located near 14th Street and Alcalde Avenue on the west side of the neighborhood. The Barelas Coffee House was opened in 1978. In early 1980, the Barelas Neighborhood Association was revived and became an extremely active and vital force for this revitalization process. The community formed a very active crime prevention committee, which partnered with the mayor's office in the Albuquerque Police Department to monitor crime activity in the neighborhood. In 1985, the community started working on the Barelas Sector Development Plan, which is a blueprint for neighborhood redevelopment. It was eventually approved in 1993 while Luis Saavedra was mayor. Our city council representative at that time was Steve Gallegos. The goals and objectives of a sector development plan are to develop a cooperative working relationship with the city and the neighborhood, to conserve and renew the unique qualities of the neighborhood, to eliminate conditions which are detrimental to the public health, safety, and welfare of the community, to promote redevelopment of the neighborhood through coordinated public and private actions, and to encourage a mixture of compatible uses. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Actually, it was a very exhaustive and intensive process which took several years to complete. At the same time, the neighborhood was working on the Barelas Commercial Revitalization Plan, which addressed the commercial issues that affected the area's businesses, institutions, churches, and schools. In 1990, the Barelas 4th Street Merchants Association formed to address and coordinate merchants' concerns in the neighborhood. In 1993, Barelas received a legislative appropriation which was sponsored by Senator Manny Aragon to create a South 4th Street streetscape project, which included the beautiful street lights, sidewalks, mosaics that depict the history of Barelas. The mosaic project was designed by the youth of the neighborhood after studying the history of the area. In 1994, the association secured Urban Development Action Grant monies to do storefront renovations of 17 buildings on 4th Street. As I mentioned before, half the buildings on 4th Street had been boarded up and the windows had bars on them. In 1996, James and Teresa Chavez, owners of the Red Ball Cafe, redeveloped and reopened the restaurant after it had been closed for more than 25 years. They did retire last year. Unfortunately, the Red Ball Cafe was closed again. In 1997, Barelas participated in the Main Street project to continue the redevelopment of the 4th Street corridor. In 1998, the Barelas Community Development Corporation was founded as a nonprofit entity to continue to secure funding for the neighborhood. In 1994, the New Mexico legislature passed enabling legislation to create the Hispanic Cultural Center. Senator Alfonso Otero had lobbied for 10 years to this end. Unfortunately, not very many people were listening to him. They had no reason to believe that a cultural center was needed anywhere. No, and they weren't listening to Senator Otero at that time. Members of the Barelas Neighborhood Association made presentations all over the state, before the Albuquerque City Council, with state legislators, before the Bernalillo County Commission, and anyone who would stand still long enough to hear the rationale as to why the center should be located in Barelas. We cited the history and culture of the area. We argued that bringing the center to Barelas was consistent with the economic development efforts that were ongoing. The City of Albuquerque Planning Department identified 5 potential sites for the location of the center. They did an exhaustive analysis and comparison of the sites. The Barelas Neighborhood Association and the Barelas Neighborhood Community strongly supported locating the center in Barelas. Senator Manny Aragon sponsored legislation directing that the cultural center would be located in the southwest quadrant of the city, and the legislation was passed. The city of Albuquerque donated 11 acres of land and made financial appropriations along with state and federal government. This totaled almost $50 million, which made the center a reality for the area. In 2000, the center had its grand opening with Crown Prince Juan Felipe of Spain in attendance, and many other dignitaries from all over the state were in attendance. The National Hispanic Culture Foundation continues to expand the center and add programs. Some important components of the center are the Museum, Research and Literary Arts Program, a Performing Arts Center, and the Plaza Mayor, and the Torreon with its magnificent fresco depicting the history of Hispanics. The center hosts and presents world-class entertainment, art shows, and community celebrations year-round. Also located at the center is the Pete Padilla and Manuel Mora Memorial Park, honoring two Barelas natives who died in combat in Vietnam. There are two sculptures, one depicting Padilla and Mora as they probably looked in their combat gear in Vietnam. The other sculpture is entitled Warriors in Repose. The sculptures were dedicated on Veterans Day in November 2015. These two sculptures honor not just these two Bareleños, but all veterans. In 1998, a nonprofit group called the Urban Council purchased 27 acres and 11 buildings from the Burlington Railroad. It created a master plan for the development of Albuquerque Station. It would reconstruct the historic buildings on the site into 240,000 square feet of state-of-the-art exposition center of international caliber. It projected 1,100 new motel rooms, more than 50,000 square feet of new retail space and restaurants, new housing, and numerous parks and plaza. As part of the project, it also included a transportation museum. The idea was to complement the existing convention center and create a destination point to attract more tourists to Albuquerque. The Urban Council invested millions during a 10-year period, but could not make the project a reality. It created partnerships with several different entities and organizations using both public and private monies. Unfortunately, the lack of funding and political support forced the project to be sold to the city of Albuquerque. This city of Albuquerque has entered into an agreement as of March 2011 with Samatar Constructs, a California master developer, to explore and develop the project. Recently, the city completed redevelopment of the blacksmith shop, which is open for community functions and activities. The Railroad Yards Market of Albuquerque operates on Sundays from 10 to 2 during the months of May to October. It is a community organized market celebrating all things local and at the heart of New Mexico culture. It is much more than your typical farmer's market. Every Sunday you can peruse hundreds of New Mexico's finest foods, artisans, and healing vendors, hear live musicians, and come away enriched from the educational demonstrations, zones for kids and adults, all under one roof at the historic blacksmith shop at the heart of Barelas. It is operated by the Barelas Community Coalition. Also located on the site of the Santa Fe Railroad shops, where my father worked, is the Wheels Museum that works to preserve the history of transportation as it pertains to Albuquerque. It is open from 10 to 2 when the market is open. As you have heard, the railroad yards have been used for filming of many movies and the nationally acclaimed Breaking Bad program. In 1999, at a meeting of at the Barelas Coffee House, with several members of the Barelas Community Development Corporation, including my dear friend Sosimo Padilla, who recently passed away, and Senator Manny Aragon. Sosimo Padilla of the Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce representative of the Barelas Community Development Corporation, a discussion ensued that the chamber was spending a lot of money on rent. Mr. Padilla proposed that the center should consider purchasing or building its own site. After a drive through Barelas, a potential site was identified. Sosimo Padilla proposed his idea to the Chamber of Commerce Board, and they passed a resolution to pursue the matter. The proposed site was owned by the Baca family of Bueno Foods, which I read in the paper this week is just celebrating its 63rd anniversary in Barelas. After negotiation and a land swap with the city, Bueno Foods received land to expand their plant in the industrial park, and the chamber was able to buy the property it needed from the city. It is located at the intersection of 4th Street and Barelas Southwest. Turned out to be a wonderful complement to the Barelas Economic Development Plan and totally consistent with neighborhood objectives. The chamber consists of 2 buildings with more than 20,000 square feet. It also houses a small business administration annex, the Barelas Job Opportunity Center, and the Barelas Small Business Development Center. The grand opening of the Albuquerque Hispano Chamber of Commerce was a very festive affair, with President George W. Bush, Senator Pete Domenici, and many officials and dignitaries from all over the state in attendance. The original Sacred Heart Church was built in 1921. In 1965, Sacred Heart Church, which is located at 4th Street and Stover, was demolished due to structural problems. The original church was built on an ancient riverbed, and the soil could no longer support the weight of the bell towers. Unfortunately, the 2 bells, many artifacts, stained glass windows, saints, and artifacts were misplaced, sold, or given away. The church was then located in the school gymnasium where it remains today. Fast forward to the year 2000. The National Hispanic Cultural Center was able to locate and purchase one of the original bells from the original church. They determined that the bell rightfully belonged to the community, so they turned it over to the church and to the Barelas community. Discussions began regarding the feasibility of returning the bell to its rightful place and putting it in the church. It is a very special bell and is more than 100 years old. It rang in Barelas since the early 1900s. The bell has emotional and historical significance to the Barelas community. The bell weighs 2,000 pounds. It's 4 inches thick, 5 feet tall, and it's made of solid copper, and we understand that it was originally cast in Spain. The bell description honors Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe del Sagrado Corazón, Our Lady of Guadalupe of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Shortly after, the tragedy of the World Trade Center occurred on September 11, 2001. Members of the Barelas Neighborhood Association and the Barelas Community Development Corporation were meeting, and a suggestion was made by Senator Manny Aragon that beams from the World Trade Center be secured so that a historic bell tower could be constructed. A motion was passed at a Barelas Community Development Corporation board meeting to pursue the idea. Letters were prepared for Representative Heather Wilson and other elected officials to be sent to the New York congressional delegation. Letters were also prepared for Archbishop Michael Sheehan to be sent to the Cardinal of New York, and a letter was prepared for the mayor of Albuquerque, Marty Chavez, to be forwarded to Mayor Bloomberg of New York City, requesting beams from the World Trade Center be donated to the Barelas community to erect a memorial bell tower. After 7 months of dialogue with the mayor's office in New York, I got a call on a Thursday evening about 9 p.m. from Mayor Bloomberg's office. Mr. Perea, we have good news and bad news for you. The good news is you have your beams. The bad news is you have to be in New York City at ground zero on Monday morning to pick them up. I asked, well, what size are they? Well, one of them is 30 feet long and weighs 15,000 pounds. The second one is 20 feet long and weighs 7,500 pounds. When we made the initial request, we actually did not know what we were asking for because we didn't know if we could get anything. We didn't know if we were asking for a 1-foot piece of metal or what we would get. Fortunately, we had made arrangements with Mr. Stan Tinker, who owned Trucking Diagnostics, a trucking firm, and he was a friend of our parish priest, Father James Moore, and he had agreed to transport whatever we got from the World Trade Center. I called him right away and told him that we had our beams and asked if his offer was still good to transport the beams for us. Yes, he said, when? I told him we had to be in New York City at ground zero on Monday morning at 8:30 a.m. You have to be kidding. I don't have a truck that I can have in New York City on Monday morning. Let me call you back. Actually, his language was a lot more colorful than this. About an hour later at 10 p.m., he calls me back and says that he has a truck unloading in LA on the following morning, Friday morning, and that he had already directed his driver to head to New York on the following day after he unloaded in LA, and he would have the truck at ground zero on Monday morning at 8:30. In the meantime, we were assembling a delegation from the community to be in New York City on Monday morning to accept the beams on behalf of the Barelas community. The beams became a gift from the city of New York to Sacred Heart Parish, to the Diocese of Santa Fe, to the people of Barelas, and to the city of Albuquerque. The delegation consisted of our parish priest, Father Moore, Sosimo Padilla, Barelas Community Development Corporation board member, and John Garcia and his wife Yolanda, who is at that time was the executive director of the Barelas Community Development Corporation. The beams were blessed at ground zero by Father James Moore and turned over to the Barelas Community Delegation by the city of New York. The delegation described what transpired in New York as at ground zero as the most emotional event that they had ever experienced. 6 stories below ground, destruction everywhere, steel bent like pretzels, iron workers handling beams with great reverence and respect for the people who had died there. The beams were loaded onto the truck and it headed to Barelas, USA. Just amazing. The driver encountered people at each stop along the way asking what he was carrying and where was he going with those crooked beams. Upon finding out what they were and where they came from, people wanted to touch the beams. They wanted to pray on them. They wanted to lift their children upon them, to touch them and to pray them, all on them, all with heartfelt reverence and respect. In the meantime, a committee was in Albuquerque preparing what was being advertised as the unveiling of the beams celebration. It was a huge event that took place at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Sidebar, the truck headed west and we had no contact with the driver all week. On Friday night before the scheduled event, I got a call from John Garcia, our project chairman, asking me if I thought the beams would be here for the Saturday morning event. I called Stank Tinker, the owner of the truck, and he indicated he had not talked to the driver in the last 2 days since he was in Tennessee. He asked me, if the truck doesn't make it with the beams by tomorrow morning, what's plan B? I said, Stan, there is no plan B. Our executive director, John Garcia, a nervous type, got up at 5 a.m. the following morning, Saturday morning, and headed out to the place where the Albuquerque Fire Department, the Albuquerque Police Department, veterans groups, and citizens from the community were to meet the truck and escort the beams into Barelas. And there was the truck, and the driver, Terry Sunhard, was asleep in the truck. He had arrived at 3 a.m., just a couple hours before. The beams arrived in Albuquerque on May the 25th, 2002. The unveiling of the beams celebration was held on the same day at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. So we had one of the original church bells, and now we have 2 beams from the World Trade Center to be incorporated into a memorial bell tower at Sacred Heart Church. Now our next challenge was to find the money to build the bell tower. Fortunately, we were able to raise the money. We were able to get materials donated. We were able to get architectural design donated by the New Mexico School of Architecture and by Decker, Parrish, Sabatini Architects. And the Lemke Construction Company, owned by Bob Stam, donated expertise and labor to build the tower. It was a massive cooperative effort with input from every segment of the Albuquerque community. And the historic bell tower was built. It was completed in June of 2003. With the marble plaque, it is something very special, and we prepared a marble plaque with the names of all the people who perished at the World Trade Center. It is a tribute to those who died at the World Trade Center with our own, very own memorial bell tower in Barelas. From the destruction of the World Trade Center came a revival of the Barelas neighborhood. The steel beams coming from the New York tragedy are now a symbol of rebirth and renewal of the Barelas community. The bell tower is a memorial to the people who died at the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. Every time the bell rings, we are reminded of these people and we honor their memories. The total value of the economic development projects I mentioned between the years of 1980 and 2000 exceeded $100 million for Barelas. A very important event in Barelas is Las Posadas de Barelas at Christmas time every year. This is the reenactment of the journey of Mary and Joseph looking for a place to stay for the birth of baby Jesus. The procession starts at the community center with stops along the way as residents' houses with Mary and Joseph seeking a place to stay and finally arriving at Sacred Heart Church. Afterwards, everyone goes to the Barelas Community Center to enjoy biscochitos and punch and enjoy a Christmas celebration. This tradition has been held in Barelas every year for more than 70 years. The Barelas community continues its goal for economic and social recovery. There have been a lot of changes in the neighborhood, and most of them have been really good. The Neighborhood Association and the Barelas Neighborhood Coalition continue to be an active and vibrant part of the community. Recently, Barelas was one of the recipients of the New Mexico Main Street Awards so that it can continue the improvement and revitalization of the neighborhood. I meet people all the time now that are proud to acknowledge that they have roots in Barelas. I guess you can tell by my remarks that I am also a very proud resident of Barelas. Thank you very much.